well, this sounds like I now have to really reconsider my attitudes around nuclear power, but then what about Chernobyl? What about Fukushima? What about all the nuclear waste? Those are really reasonable questions to ask. And in fact, when I was starting to ask them, there were other people that were starting to change their mind. One of the ones who I was most impressed by and was very influential is a British newspaper columnist named George Monbiot. George Monbiot wrote a column shortly after Fukushima where he went through the scientific research on radiation, and what he wrote was, the anti-nuclear movement to which I once belonged has misled the world about the impacts of radiation on human health. I write some pretty harsh things sometimes, but this was a pretty strong column. He was talking to a number of scientists that actually have studied the big accidents. One of them is Jerry Thomas from Imperial College in London. Jerry started something called the Chernobyl Tissue Bank out of her concern for the accident, and totally independent professor of pathology at Imperial College. And I asked her, I said, I'd like to present this, but I'm not a radiation scientist, so can I just steal your slides? I'll put your picture on them, if you let me do that. The first thing she points out is she says, most ionizing radiation, that's the radiation that is potentially harmful that comes from a nuclear accident, most of it's natural. And I was like, well, that sounds all right, you know? I like natural foods, natural radiation sounds good, the hot springs, you know? And she said, no, actually, natural ionizing radiation is just as harmful potentially as artificial radiation. So that's kind of the first thing. The striking thing about it is that the total amount of ionizing radiation we're exposed to from not just Chernobyl and Fukushima, but also all of the atomic bomb testing in the 60s and 70s totals just 0.3% of our exposures. Most of the radiation we're exposed to is just from the Earth or from the atmosphere or from the buildings around us. Let's look at the big one. This is Chernobyl. This is the event that really scared me about nuclear and led me to be an anti-nuclear activist. United Nations has done these very large, comprehensive studies. It's hundreds of scientists around the world that do this research. So the possibility of somebody fudging the data or maybe trying to cover something up is pretty low in that environment, just because there's so many different credible scientists at different universities around the world doing the research. So this is really, I think, was a pivotal moment for me. Chernobyl is the worst nuclear accident we've ever had, and I think there's some people that say it's the worst we could ever have. I don't need to make a statement that strong, but they literally had a nuclear reactor without a containment dome, and it was on fire. Like, it was like just raining radiation around everybody, you know. It was a really terrible accident. And when they start counting bodies, what they come up with is 28 deaths from acute radiation syndrome, 15 deaths over the last 25 years from thyroid cancer, which, as horrible as it sounds, it's actually the best cancer to get because hardly anybody dies from it. It's really treatable. You can take thyroxine, which is a synthetic substitute, get a surgery. In fact, most of the people that died were people that were in remote rural areas that couldn't get the medical treatment they needed. And if you take the 16,000 people that got thyroid cancer from Chernobyl, they estimate 160 of them will die from thyroid cancer. And it's not like they're dying like right now. Like, they'll die of it in old age. And that's not to say that it's okay, but it is to put it in some kind of context. There's no scientific evidence of thyroid cancer outside of those three main countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. No effect on fertility, malformations, infant mortality. No data for adverse pregnancy outcomes. No evidence for any genetic effects. And I think this last one is the most striking thing. There's no evidence of any increase in cancer, including in the cohort of people who put the fire out and cleaned up afterwards. And I still am surprised by this finding. And so I put the link to the website on there. I don't think you should take my word for it. I think you should go read it, because just reading about Chernobyl for me was a big part of changing my mind about nuclear power.